I'd like to welcome all of you here this evening. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jeffrey Weidlinger, the director of the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies here at the University of Michigan. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's Bellin Lecture. The David W. Bellin Lecture in American Jewish Affairs was established in 1991 through a generous gift from the late David W. Bellin of Des Moines in New York to provide an academic forum for the discussion of contemporary Jewish life in the United States. Mr. Bellin, a graduate of LSA, the business school, and the law school at the University of Michigan, had a distinguished career in law and public service. An exemplary public servant, Bellin served as counsel to the Warren Commission, which investigated President John F. Kennedy's assassination, and was executive director to the Rockefeller Commission, which investigated CIA activities within the United States. A founding chairman of Reform Judaism's Outreach Commission and founding member of the Jewish Foundation for the Righteous, Bellin served the American Jewish communities in numerous leadership roles. That service reflected his concern for the future of American Jewry and stimulated him to endow this annual lectureship to provide a forum for the discussion of contemporary Jewish life in the United States. In addition to the lecture that you'll all be hearing tonight, we also publish a written version of each lecture. Last year's are available outside by Ruth Bessinger, and Jim Leffler's will be available in about a year or so from now, give or take, outside at the next one, at next year's. And I can even tell you who next year's will be. Sneak preview, next year's will be Pam Nadell. Will be speaking here next year. So mark your calendars for March of 2020. Tonight's speaker, though, Jim Leffler, holds the J. Berkowitz Chair in Jewish History at the University of Virginia, where he teaches courses on Jewish and European history, legal history, and the history of human rights. His first book, The Most Musical Nation, Jews and Culture in the Late Russian Empire, was a Jordan Schnitzler Award finalist and a finalist for the Sammy Rohr Prize in Jewish Literature, as well as the recipient of numerous other awards and accolades. He's been the recipient of numerous fellowships and grants, including fellowships from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Library of Congress, and a Mellon New Directions Fellowship, which allowed him to study law at Georgetown University's Law Center. His most recent book, Rooted Cosmopolitans, Jews and Human Rights in the 20th Century, which is available for purchase outside, presents a sweeping and gripping narrative of the development of human rights. Through outstanding research, Leffler shows that the notion of human rights was not only developed by individuals who happened to have been of Jewish heritage, but that the development of the idea of human rights grew out of specifically Jewish concerns and was deeply rooted within a Jewish intellectual environment as a specific response to Jewish suffering during the pogroms of the early 20th century, the Holocaust, and violence in the Middle East. He also shows that it existed in conjunction with advocacy for a Jewish state, which to many of the intellectual and legal giants who promoted the ideals of human rights embodied the fulfillment of those goals. Thanks to Leffler's contributions, the politics of human rights will be able to take its place alongside the variety of Jewish nationalisms and internationalisms that competed for attention in the Jewish political sphere. The Washington Post wrote of his book, "This superb book is an homage to visionary cosmopolitans dedicated to the creation of human rights in a world too often lacking in humanity." Tonight's lecture, Prisoners of Zion, American Jews, Human Rights in the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, takes the idea that Professor Leffler introduced in his book to the next stage, looking at the intertwined history of human rights and Zionism as it continues to play out in the world today. So please join me in welcoming for the first time to Ann Arbor, Professor Jim Leffler.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here and deliver this lecture. I will tell you, I'm someone who has followed not only the work of the Frankel Institute, but this lecture series for many years and used it in my research and in my teaching. And it's a very unique resource, I think, because of the nature of the way it's carefully put together and the fact that you ask us also to contribute something in print after. It's a wonderful thing. So I want to thank everyone who's made this possible, and I want to thank Jeff, as well as the staff of the Frankel Center for making the visit possible and bringing us all together tonight. So I want to start by just telling you a joke. I like to tell this joke to start this talk. And the joke is about two old Jewish guys sitting on a bench, and one turns to his friend, and he looks at him and he says, "Oi." And the second guy looks back at his friend, and he pauses, and he just says, "Oi." First one looks, says, "Oi." Next guy looks back and says, "Oi." And it goes on for a few minutes, and finally the first one says, "I thought we agreed not to talk about Israel." So I have to start with that to break our tension here and to say we're going to talk about Israel and human rights, which is a double oi for many people when they think about them, because this is a conjunction of topics which seems to only trigger controversy, headlines, cynicism, anger, suspicion, indignation, and lots of ois. So the goal of tonight's lecture is not to argue about it, but to explain, to inquire, and to reflect. And the goal, as you heard, is to take some research which I did in the context of writing this book and add to it, to fill in and broaden some of that, to share with you some context about how we got to this moment of ois, and to imagine what was happening and what has continued to shape how we think about these topics and how they come together, so as not to produce a solution to all the ois in the world, but to have a better understanding. That's the goal, and I hope you'll share with me afterwards your questions and thoughts. I want to begin by diagnosing the problem more specifically. And I'll do it by talking about what I call the story of a failed op-ed. It begins in 1988. 1988 was a banner year for the group Amnesty International, human rights organization. The group's rock tours had helped to make human rights a household word, phrase. It had now begun to reach a global audience like never before. And 1988 was a double anniversary. It was the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UN's UDHR, and as well as another event, which was the founding of the State of Israel. So someone in the New York office of Amnesty decided, this is a hook, let's write an op-ed about this. And in April of 1988, they authored a draft of an op-ed, which read in part as follows. This year marks the 40th anniversary of two important events in the history of the human rights movement. On May 15th, the 40th anniversary of the State of Israel will be celebrated. This December 10th, we will celebrate the 40th anniversary of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And then it went on to talk about how these were two ancient dreams that came together and were fulfilled, and also that there's still something left to be done. Op-ed draft reads in part, if Israel is to fulfill the dream as a nation among nations, it must fulfill the dream of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The future of Israel depends on it. The future of the world may depend on it. Now, these two events were linked in the minds of these authors. These were two people who worked in the communications division of Amnesty. These were obvious and had to be explained together. But the op-ed never ran because the staff who began to discuss it decided, no, it just doesn't work. So why didn't it run? That's the first question, and then I'm going to pause and make you wait till the end of the lecture to hear about it. But suffice it to say, this is a moment, and it's an interesting conjunction of these topics that they at Amnesty International in 1988 would imagine that you had to address these two anniversaries. We just passed 2018, which was another moment of anniversaries, the 70th anniversary of Israel and of the UDHR. And there was a whole wave of discussion and debate about that. What was the significance of them? And how were they connected? Pause my slides. Somehow got a little bit mixed up, but there we are. Now, what is the moment that we're in? I think it's fair to say that this is a kind of contentious topic and conjunction, as I alluded to. And for American Jews thinking about it, American Jews, of course, occupy all kinds of positions on the political spectrum, right? From the far anti-Zionist left to Ben Shapiro, who's speaking as we congregate here across campus, to the further or far right. But many, if not most American Jews, find themselves in a kind of moment of confusion and schizophrenia when they think about topics such as human rights and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Many American Jews lean left and liberal in their politics, and human rights as an idea and a cause is central to a kind of civic religion of American Jewish identity. Part of the quest for liberalism and social justice, many American Jews remember the Soviet Jewish movement and think of this as a story about making the world safer for everyone, as well as helping Jews. Many think about the work of civil rights as connected to the international struggle for human rights. And many Jews also refer back constantly to the Holocaust as a natural explanation for why we have human rights and the special significance of the Jewish experience for the world as a whole. Yet at the same time, many American Jews, including those on the left, are deeply suspicious of the international human rights movement, organizations like Amnesty. They see this movement as somehow uniquely focused against Israel, if not anti-Israel, if not, for some, anti-Semitic. Many American Jews who declare themselves to the left nevertheless cheer when the U.S. withdraws from the UN Human Rights Council because they say good riddance. Many contest or dismiss Palestinian claims about human rights violations as propaganda or politically biased. And many struggle with this issue about reconciling these commitments. They valorize human rights, but they also are suspicious of human rights as something which is threatening. There are many explanations of this. One explanation is an explanation that the far left brings, and that's the simple tagline, progressive except for Palestine, right? For those on the far left or other progressives, American Jews are just hypocrites, right? They love human rights, except not when it comes to criticizing Israel. And so they see this as basically a political drama that American Jews are inconsistent or willfully blind to it. What's interesting for me, and I became aware of this in the writing of this book, is there's a parallel story on the right, where there's an explanation which is that the problem isn't American Jews, it's not Israel, it's just human rights, and that the human rights movement really has an ingrained anti-Semitic component, and that human rights, except for the Jews, can basically explain why Jews have such a problem with it. My goal in writing this book, and my goal tonight with you, is to find a more satisfying answer, one that's grounded in history. And to solve this puzzle, maybe not to find a solution for us, but to solve this puzzle explaining these different mirror images, we need to look beyond some of these cliches. The cliches about American exceptionalism, the cliches about how the Holocaust just gave us human rights, or Jews are naturally inclined to social justice, and give Jews a different political history of their engagement with human rights, as well as to give human rights a political history of its own. Because if we see human rights only as a universalist endeavor, rather than a political culture linked to an imagination and a people and place and times, then we won't really be able to see how it too changes, and it actually changes in conjunction with many things inside the Jewish experience. So that's the setup for what I want to talk to you about today. More specifically, I want to build on the story I told in my book and look at the interactions between American Jews and Amnesty International across the 60s, 70s, and 80s that explains some events and key turning points in that period of time, as well as the period that we still inhabit today. And I want to do it in terms of 3 words that I'll just plant in your minds before I get really into the heart of the story. And these words are neutrality, symmetry, and influence. And I think they're words that we need to kind of unpack because they're also words that continue to be surfacing in our political debates today about American Jews and about power and about anti-Semitism in general. Where to start? The idea of human rights has a long pedigree in Western thought. We can speak about deep roots. We can speak about Greco-Roman ideals of the law of nations and human equality. We can speak about Jewish and Christian ideals of dignity and justice. But human rights as we know them really date from the 20th century and really come into focus after World War II. This is when the nations of the world created the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and they created a system of international law, which was premised on the principle that you had to guarantee the rights of everyone across the world because you couldn't simply rely on their own countries to support them and to give them the rights through citizenship and constitutions and other political and legal arrangements. Human rights had to be international, and humanity was responsible for projecting them above the heads of governments, and then also protecting them. Jews played prominent roles inside that story, particularly in the years up to 1948 and in 1948. Some of the people I talk about in the book are, their images, their photographs are up here in this slide. These include American Jews, as well as European Jews and Israeli Jews, who drafted much of the language and many of the building blocks and many of the laws that we think of as comprising this body of international human rights. This includes that Universal Declaration I mentioned to you. It also includes things such as the International Refugee Convention, which was pioneered by the man in the further left middle, that's Jacob Robinson, who was working for the Israeli government when he developed this, and all kinds of other movements and initiatives. Here's Raphael Lemkin in the bottom right-hand corner, the author of the Genocide Convention, and various other figures. What is interesting in this story is well before our current moment of controversy, many of these people came to be deeply disappointed in the work that they had just put decades, in some cases, into creating, and began to talk about human rights as already a failure in the 1950s and the early 1960s. So what was the failure? To tell you about the failure, I want to introduce you to someone I mentioned in passing in the book, who is a fascinating figure inside this story. And this is a man named Mark Benenson, who was one of the founders of the American branch of Amnesty International. Mark Benenson was the grandson of Russian Jewish immigrants who settled in upstate New York, where they ran a farm and a hotel, Ulster County. His father was a prominent lawyer and liberal Republican, Reform Republican in New York City. He was also a DA. Mark himself graduated, like many Jews of his generation, from City College, then went on to Columbia Law School. And he became a successful labor lawyer in the 1950s and 60s, as well as a civil liberties advocate. He also, and this is an interesting footnote to him, became a very, very prominent advocate of gun rights. He was probably one of the most famous liberal gun Second Amendment defenders in US history. So it's already an interesting story that that's the person who created the American branch of Amnesty. Now, what does Mark Benenson have to say about human rights and what the problem is? In an interview, shortly after launching this branch of this International Human Rights Organization, he explained what Amnesty was all about and what they were trying to do. And you can see from this quote here that it's about fixing something which has just begun and is already broken. Quote, less is done in more time by high IQs about human rights there at the United Nations, especially at committee meetings, than anywhere else on this planet. It's too easy for an NGO, a non-governmental organization, to become UNified and to fall into the easy ways of the new international bureaucrats of human rights, who spend most of their time talking to each other. What is he getting at there? The answer is, here's a lawyer in the 1960s saying that human rights is too important to just restrict it to what is happening in that world of law, international law. The United Nations has created this Universal Declaration. It's proclaimed all of these ideals after World War II, after the Holocaust, but it's been reduced immediately to diplomats and bureaucrats arguing and talking and not doing anything. So something else has to change. And the solution actually comes from his cousin. And there's the slide we saw before. Because it turns out that Mark Benenson is part of a very interesting, illustrious clan of Jews and Jewish political and philanthropic activists who are basically responsible for much of what we think of as human rights today. Amnesty International was begun in 1961. And it was begun by this man, Peter Benenson, Mark's cousin. I'm not going to talk too much about him. I could give you a whole lecture about him because he was a fascinating figure, but my charge tonight is to talk to you about American Jews. I'm going to talk more about Mark and his experience. Suffice it to say that Peter Benenson was, at the time, a 40-year-old British lawyer from a branch of the family that left Russia, and instead of coming here, they went to England. And they went on to become very prominent philanthropists. His grandfather was one of the leading donors to the Zionist movement in the 1920s. His mother was an activist in British politics. She was an activist in the Women's International Zionist Organization. She was best friends with Vera Weitzman, the wife of Chaim Weitzman, the leader of the Zionist movement. And her son, Peter, was raised partly in Jerusalem, and then he came back and he went to boarding school and he dropped out to rescue Jewish children during the Holocaust. And he became a lawyer and active in civil liberties. And then he began to think about international law and human rights law. And he went through a very interesting crisis, which involved converting to Catholicism. And then he started Amnesty. And he started Amnesty because he said at the time, much like his cousin Mark, human rights isn't working. This is in 1961. It's not working because all that law that's being talked about isn't making governments do better by their own people, and because the universal ideals are being hamstrung by politics as well. So we need a new approach, which won't be simply focusing on law and the UN, nor will it be simply focused on politics. In fact, the very idea of amnesty was a quest for total ultimate neutrality. What does that mean? Well, the system that's set up by amnesty in 1961 is one in which it's all going to be grassroots, right? It's all going to be volunteers, and those volunteers are going to work with strict ideological neutrality, in which they are not going to focus on any human rights issues in their own country. They're only going to focus on another country. They're not just going to pick one country. Each group will pick 3 prisoners from 3 countries, one representing a Western democratic country, the second representing a communist country, and the third representing a non-aligned country, or what would have been called, or might still be called, the Third World, the Global South, or neutral in the Cold War. So you're going to make it strictly neutral. And then these volunteers are going to advocate by writing letters and advocating for the release of these prisoners. Who are these prisoners? The focus of this human rights movement will be prisoners of conscience. That means people who have been imprisoned unfairly because of their religious beliefs or their political beliefs. Importantly, for our story, these prisoners cannot be people who have endorsed or used violence. And so one of the interesting puzzles that happens right away is the case of apartheid. And Amnesty International famously decides not to sponsor Nelson Mandela because he may be a freedom fighter, but he's a fighter. And therefore, he's not their remit. Human rights has to be totally neutral, and it has to be focused on people who are not involved in those kind of violent struggles. So this was the brainchild of Peter. And it quickly began to spread, and then it crossed the pond over here, where it grew into a movement and an organization that Mark Benenson helped set up beginning in 1966. Now, what is interesting about this is that it was a heavily Jewish venture. Now, I'm not going to parse the whole nature of what is a Jewish, not a Jewish organization. This is not a Jewish organization. It was not only Jews involved in it, but it is interesting that it attracted a wide variety of very prominent people in American Jewish life, and people who are not prominent but very important in their own right for their activism of different kinds. This is a roster of some of the people involved in the early years of starting the American branch of Amnesty International. They include Rita Hauser, who was a pioneering female law school graduate, as well as a lawyer and a Republican political leader and a U.S. diplomat to the UN. Sally Lilienthal, who was famous as a San Francisco area philanthropist, a progressive activist, a longtime supporter of the NAACP, and probably most famous as the founder of Plowshares, the anti-nuclear group. Theo Bickel, the great folk singer and actor. Arthur Danto, the cultural critic and art critic. Ginny Sagan, who was herself a Holocaust survivor of Italian Jewish extraction and went on to become a very, very prominent social activist and progressive activist in politics and civil rights in California. Yetta Lackner, who was very active in the United Farm Workers Movement, one of the core people in it for a time. Jacob Javits, who was a liberal Republican senator and congressman from New York. And Arthur Michelson, another lawyer and activist in these circles. So there's a whole range of these people who are involved and are drawn in very quickly from both the East Coast and the West Coast to this amnesty. They all have their different reasons for joining, but they all see this as kind of an easy onboarding process, an easy venture for them as American Jews to fight and join this cause for human rights in this kind of universalist sense that will address anti-Semitism as well as other issues along the way. And Mark Benenson is basically the person who ropes in each of these people in different ways through his own networks. So what happens? This is the picture in the 60s, and then comes 67. 67, you will all know, is the Six-Day War, right? And for many people viewing it, we think it's inevitable that human rights and Jewish politics would clash in 67. But it's an interesting thing to look more closely and to slow down and look at what was happening inside Amnesty International at this moment in time when it begins to think about human rights and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. One of the first things that happens is that Amnesty begins to get reports of torture in Israeli military prisons. And I talk a little bit about this in the book. I'm going to talk about it, as I said, in more detail here. Amnesty begins to get reports. The Israelis are torturing Arab prisoners, both Arab citizens of Israel as well as Palestinians that are now under their control. What do we do about this? And the British branch of Amnesty begins to debate this. Some of them say, we have to investigate. We're a human rights group, and we ought to be dealing with this issue. It's a huge issue. Others are saying, we don't deal with war zones. We have a very specific thing we do because we want to be neutral. And we don't know about this information. Is it true? Is it not true? The Israelis say, don't investigate. This is basically propaganda coming from the other side. And the debate rages on. And eventually, the British leaders of Amnesty decide we have to investigate. We have to investigate because we've been hearing about all these problems for a long time. Some of our leaders say Israel's gotten a free pass. Others say we have to expand. This is too urgent an issue not to embrace. And then the American branch of Amnesty begins to voice deep concern. The first concern comes from Mark. And he says, as you can see in argument as I've phrased it in capsule form up here, basically to do this is to violate our own policies that made us neutral in all of our approach to human rights. Quote, Amnesty made a decision a long time ago that we would not assist political prisoners who had advocated or engaged in violence. If you get a gun, you have to take your chances on what happens to you. These prisoners, are terrorists. Neutral Amnesty is being manipulated into not so neutral a position. Now, he was referring specifically to prisoners, many of whom had been identified with Fatah, so as to say they were members of a group that was identified by the Israelis as terrorist organization. But of course, then and now, there are always these debates. Is this person definitely the same person who's identified? Is that the same prisoner? Is that correct? Is this person actually a member, or is just somebody who believes in the cause but has never committed a crime? All these issues that we're all well familiar with because they become issues as well in the way we think about terrorism today. Mark Bennison's point is, for that reason alone, we shouldn't get involved. Right? We're not in a position to judge who these people are. Many of these people, though, are advocating violence, and therefore they just don't belong. If Amnesty does this, Amnesty is going to be compromised. What happens? He gets in a large discussion and a large argument with the British branch. And the British branch, the leaders of it, come back to him and they say, we've already debated this and we think we have to investigate. So we're going to try and find a way to do this. We're going to take every step we can to make sure we're getting accurate information. And we're going to go one step further, which is we're going to go to the Israeli government and we're going to ask them to cooperate with us. And we're going to do this together. We're not going to do this as a political move. We're going to do this in the greatest spirit of what human rights can be, absolutely neutral, to address this question. And Benenson says, it's never going to work. You're going to walk into a political trap. You're going to lose your neutrality. Oops. My slides are a little bit out of order, so bear with me. So what happens? There's a complicated dance between the British leadership of Amnesty International and the Israeli government, and eventually they have a joint investigation, believe it or not, in 1969 and 1970. And then it all falls apart. It all falls apart because the Israelis conclude, you found no evidence of the allegations that you came to investigate. And the British leadership of Amnesty say, no, actually, we think we found enough to issue a report. And there's a whole fracas and a controversy. And basically, they publish the report and Israel denounces it. And as I talk about in the book, this is basically a scenario that we're familiar with because it's played out again and again and again in the problem of human rights engagement with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Suffice to say, though, for our purposes, what's important is how American Jews inside Amnesty react. Mark Benenson flies over to London with Theo Beckel, and they go to the annual meeting, and they say this report is a shanda, right? They say this report is a mess. It was not accurate. You betrayed your commitment to work with the Israeli government, and the evidence here is still not conclusive, and now you're politically compromised. They are ostracized by many people there who basically say, you're here because you're Jews, and you have a problem with what's being dispatched as criticism against Israel, so we know what this is. This is a Jewish issue. And they fight back and they say that's basically anti-Semitic. And a fight begins to break out inside Amnesty. And it's a fight also among these people of trying to figure out over the course of 1969, 1970, what do they do? Some of these people think that there is a decided, as they say, anti-Israel bias in the organization that's just manifested itself. Others feel like, no, we need to stick with our organization, and this is where the evidence has led them. And the people up here also begin to debate about whether or not Amnesty has now developed, basically, it's lost its neutrality, it's lost its way or not. One of the problems with this is that, as I just said a second ago, immediately it becomes refracted for the issue about who these people are and the fact that the leadership of American Amnesty is heavily Jewish, at least in its board and its perception. And British members begin to contact their branch and say, well, we all know what's going on here, and you can't expect any Jews to be neutral about Israel, because they're all inclined to Israel one way or another, right? And so many of the same issues we think about today are surfacing, and Amnesty is frankly struggling with what to make of this. They're struggling, the leadership, with what to make of it. For Mark Benenson and Theo Bickel and others in the US, regardless of that struggle, it's clear what has to be done. And so in 1970, they issue a statement and they disavow this report. And they basically say, we do not agree with the British branch. They're wrong on Israel. They've got it wrong. This report is a travesty. It shouldn't have been issued. And this leads to a crisis where things actually begin to fragment between the two groups. And at one point, it seems as if the American branch may collapse or split off, or who knows what's going to happen. It also leads to a lot of criticism. And many of these leaders I keep pointing up to begin to voice doubts. They begin to voice doubts about whether Amnesty can do this work or not. Amnesty in the UK struggles with this, but eventually much of the debate comes down to, if we can't resolve to everyone's satisfaction the issue of neutrality, maybe we can come up with a different thing that will solve this problem. And this is going to be through symmetry. What do I mean by symmetry? At the same moment as this crisis involving Israel is happening, American Jews are becoming more and more focused on another drama of human rights, which is the issue of Soviet Jews and Jews in the communist world. There are millions of Jews in the Soviet Union, no one knows exactly how many, who are clearly suffering anti-Semitism at that time in the late 60s and early 70s. In addition, they're beginning to agitate to leave, right, for the right to leave the Soviet Union. And this is beginning to be a very strong priority for American Jewish leaders, and it's beginning to be an international issue at this time. So one of the things that happens is some of these American Jewish leaders begin to say, well, if Amnesty is going to show that it is neutral, maybe it should show it by balancing out what it does. Maybe it should focus on this drama of millions of Jews who are facing anti-Semitism, and this is a human rights cause that needs to be addressed. These people were known as prisoners of Zion, right? And it's an interesting word that I'll come back to. But this refers specifically to those Jews who wished to leave. Sometimes it's applied to those Jews who advocated directly to exercise Zionism, to identify with Israel, to do Hebrew studies, or just to move there. But it also becomes a catch-all phrase to describe these Jews who are prisoners of this anti-Semitic regime. So a debate begins to happen between the Americans and the British in Amnesty about this case, as well as, to a lesser extent, the case of Jews in the Middle East and those communities and what will happen to them. And the British Amnesty leadership basically says, we do want to do symmetry, but we can't really take up this issue, because this isn't, properly speaking, an Amnesty issue. Amnesty focuses on individual prisoners. So if there's a Jew who's suffered because of his or her religious freedom or political beliefs, we can take up that cause. But a mass issue isn't what we do. That's mission creep. That's beyond our remit as an organization. To which some of these American Jewish leaders respond by saying, well, now you've just shown us that you really don't care about the Jewish issue in the same way. There isn't the balance here. Because if you cared, you would recognize that this is a very fundamental issue of human rights that needs to be addressed. So the leadership of Amnesty says, we do care about Jews, and we have a symmetry we're going to propose for you. But that symmetry is not going to come through addressing the issue of Jews stuck in the Soviet Union or Jews facing anti-Semitic persecution in the Middle East. That's going to come through this other issue, which is now developed. So you can see what I'm kind of moving us through is a story of the 1970s. Because by 1973, there's been another war in the Middle East, and now there are Israeli prisoners of war who are stuck in Syrian prisons in particular, and there are also Syrian prisoners of war held by Israelis after 1973. Why is this the issue? Well, the issue is that the British branch of Amnesty looks at this and says, well, here's a perfect symmetry, right? Where we can go in and we can address Israel and another country. And you can't accuse us of being one-sided because we're going to address both of them at the same time. And these are prisoners, and most importantly, we've received reports of torture. So therefore, we can go in and deal with this. They don't decide at this moment to deal with Palestinians as a whole. They don't decide to deal with other Jewish communities, as I've said. They decide to deal with this. And they say, we're going to do an investigation here. And here is, as I said, symmetry. What happens inside the American leadership is an interesting drama. Because, again, these different people, and I highlight these folks, begin to argue back and forth about this. Should they agree, once again, with those London colleagues of theirs who are saying that Amnesty International should pursue this issue? Many of these people, many of these leaders say no. We don't trust them. They botched the investigation after the Six-Day War, so just stay out of the Middle East. Don't touch Israel. Right? Others say, we feel that way, but if we say this, and these, I'm describing to you a scenario which you can see emerging from the letters written back and forth between these people. If we criticize our London colleagues, they'll say we're pro-Zionist. So now they're experiencing a certain discomfort about the appearances of themselves. Right? And a fight breaks out, in particular between these three people over here and this woman over here, Yetta Lackner. So Yetta issues a huge report, and she says, I think our organization is biased. I think our organization, including our American Amnesty, is too pro-Israel. It is too pro-Zionist. And I'm a Jew, but I don't agree with this. I think we have to do more. We should do this report on these POWs, and we should do more overall. And she begins to go around and actually voice these concerns to other people. And the other folks, Sally and Ginny, who are on the West Coast as well, begin to send letters back to the East Coast colleagues saying that she's going around doing a whisper campaign and she's ruining our donor base. Amnesty is about to collapse because she's going around and she's poisoning the well because we have a lot of Jewish donors, and they're very upset that this anti-Zionist Jew is now speaking out against Israel and saying Amnesty should target Israel. Meanwhile, these are progressive activists who are struggling with the place of Israel and Zionism in progressive politics in this period in the early 1970s. And in the middle is this man, Arthur Michelson, who his response to this controversy is to say, I think that Amnesty has not done so well by Israel in the past. I do think there's a problem there, but I can handle it because I care more about the larger mission of human rights. So I don't want to fall into a trap of fighting between ourselves about this. I think we need to move past this in a judicious way. This is an internal debate that happens. The report I've described to you about Syrian and Israeli POWs is issued over some of these objections. And then, again, the American branch issues another statement of breaking with it and denouncing it. Amnesty USA deplores the failure of the report to give a fair and proportionate presentation of both sides, i.e., you botched it again. Our British colleagues botched it again, and they messed this up. And they go on to say, why? Right? Why choose this particular area for the first POW report ever issued by Amnesty? Why do you give Israel the favor of making it sort of the test case for this new phase of Amnesty's work? Arthur Michelson actually is the person who authors most of the text, actually, that I show you in this slide. And having said, I stand by this organization, I do not want it to get dragged down, even if I don't like what it says, he says this report is a mistake. So what's going on here? I think it's fair to say that these are leaders, American Jews, struggling not just with dual commitments. I don't actually think this is a case of dual commitments. They're struggling with these concepts of what it means to do human rights. What is it? How can it be neutral when it always involves making choices, which countries to do, how to design a report, how to create symmetry, right? And the problem they also find is this is being magnified in a kind of echo chamber because they live in a world where people are suspicious of each other's motives, and certain members of their organization leadership are accusing others of bias and of sympathies and loyalties, which they may or may not have. This only intensifies over the course of 1974 and 1975 because two things happen. The first is that the Soviet Jewish issue becomes central to American politics. And the American left, the center left, which is to say the Democrats, Cold War Democrats, begin to take up the cause of Soviet Jews. Right? This is Scoop Jackson and a whole bunch of politicians who view this as a very important way to help push against the Soviet Union in the Cold War and help these Jewish people who are imprisoned there. And this is a kind of convergence of Jewish concerns with American foreign policy in a new way, an unprecedented way. This happens at exactly the same moment as there's an intensification of the campaign against Zionism at the UN and the infamous declaration in 1975 that Zionism is a form of racism. UN General Assembly Resolution 3379. So what's happening here? Basically, Jewish concerns are being swept into American foreign policy. Amnesty is finding itself stuck with the Israeli-Arab conflict and how to negotiate its way through. The American Jews in Amnesty are trying to figure out where they sit in between these different things. Worse so, when they go to their Amnesty colleagues and say, well, will you at least take up this issue about Zionism as racism? Will you at least issue a statement? You're the world's most famous human rights group. And the response from the leadership, the British leadership, is no, because we want to be neutral. We don't want to get involved in this, right? So you can see this is a mess, and these are the threads that are becoming woven more and more tightly together. In 1977, Amnesty wins the Nobel Prize. And from that point onwards, it goes on to become an incredibly well-known and popular organization. Right? Before this, there's no Amnesty branches on US campuses. Amnesty is not a household name. Human rights isn't as well known. It's a province of lawyers and diplomats, and after this, it's something that everyone cares about, just like they begin to care about the environment as an issue that is any thinking person would want to know about, would have an opinion about, and is important for a kind of foundation principle of progressive values and global grassroots politics. So Amnesty is now at a height of its prestige by the end of the 1970s. And yet these issues I've described to you have not resolved themselves. Amnesty is also changing, however, and it's going from a grassroots organization to a new kind of professional organization. What do I mean by that? Amnesty is professionalizing. Before this, it is still basically limited to people who volunteer their time to write letters, to go to rallies and write letters. It's a volunteer organization. It does have some staff members, but it's basically volunteer. By the at the end of the 70s and by the early 80s, Amnesty has begun to develop subject experts. They now have researchers who work full-time to study different countries and to issue reports about those countries. They no longer work simply on prisoners, but now they work on issues. The first big issue is torture. And they go on to address different issues about campaigns that we will market across the world. Marketing is really the word because they also begin to use advertising, and they begin to use direct mail, and they begin to become an organization of members, not just volunteers, in which people give money to support the work of other people who work in offices to do that. And they also do something which makes them the most famous of all the human rights activists and organizations, which is they have the genius to partner with rock and roll musicians, and to develop this series of incredibly popular concerts across the late 80s, where they recruit the biggest names in music to do concerts for the benefit of Amnesty, PS sponsored by Reebok, the shoe company, showing you that human rights has now intersected with global capitalism in a new way. What does all this mean for the Jews? The key thing that I want to highlight here is if we've talked about neutrality and symmetry and these concepts as they play out for American Jewish leaders and they play out with Amnesty. as Amnesty becomes more and more influential and more visible, it struggles with the actual meaning of that influence. And so in a certain sense, just as American Jews are struggling with this issue of influence, do we look powerful? Are we powerful? What does it mean to talk about exercising influence? Human rights activists as a whole are also beginning to think about that. And as they're doing that, Amnesty is finding itself with a new level of scrutiny about its activities. And it's beginning to become almost like a palimpsestum to which people are projecting different views about these things. So here I put up a selection of just some of the different reactions. Mark Benenson quits in 1981, and he says, "I'm done. No rule says liberals and leftists can't do good, and Amnesty has done plenty. But let's not pretend that Amnesty International has no politics." Right? What we've seen since 1967 is this is a good organization, but it has politics. It makes choices. And American Jews are the first people to kind of recognize that because they got caught in between its politics and its idealism. Others take more stark positions for or against what Amnesty is doing in terms of whether it is pro-Israel or anti-Israel. So Eleanor Herzog is one American Jew who writes in and voices the classic trope. "As a Jew, I am appalled by the behavior of Israel toward the Palestinians, and I think that your silence on this issue bespeaks a bias on the part of your organization." And there are many other letters like this, which basically say Amnesty is still pro-Israel because it doesn't tackle the issues enough and the cause of the Palestinians. And many other voices are beginning to say, in fact more from the American Jewish sphere, that Amnesty has not only an Israel problem, it has an Israel obsession. How did Amnesty International, an avowedly nonpartisan, peace-loving organization, embark on the task of lending comfort to violent Arab militants? This from an article by Jonathan Auerbach in the Boston Phoenix, the late, great local newspaper there. And so you see this polarization taking hold of how people perceive Amnesty. Some say it's not doing enough, some saying it's doing way too much, but for the wrong side, so to speak. In September of 1986, Amnesty calls for direct investigation, again, of torture of Palestinian prisoners. At the same time, Jewish staff members, and this is a sensitive issue because some of these people still don't want to speak publicly about it, but Jewish staff members begin to quit Amnesty because they feel that there's now anti-Semitism inside the organization, regardless of their politics on Israel. And so this whole mess of things is accelerating because everyone is now struggling with the optics of what it means to be a Jew who works with Amnesty or what Amnesty does vis-a-vis a Jewish-related issue. And I think that ultimately this is an issue about the issue of, too many issues, of power. Now, what do I mean by that? Amnesty, as Amnesty grows in what it's doing and grows more visible and begins to be more of an international actor that now governments focus on and complain about and argue with. Amnesty is doing politics. It doesn't mean that it's one-sided ideological, but it's grappling with what it means to do politics as an organization that was created to be completely apolitical. And this is, in fact, what the board of Amnesty grapples with in this moment of the 86, 87, and 88. The board itself grapples with this issue. Are we biased on Israel? Do we have a problem? And they come up with the conclusion that no, we keep getting stuck in this because it's just such a difficult issue, but we don't have a particular problem. And I want to stress here, this is the American branch of it talking about it. But then they go on to say that we focus on Israel because Israel's singularly important, and we, in the American leadership of our organization, feel we have to do something because the U.S. has a lot of power in Israel. So here's the quote. "Of the nations in the Middle East, Israel is the one in which the U.S. has the most influence and hence the one in which the U.S. section of Amnesty International can be the most effective." And I think here again is that word that I tried to emphasize, influence. So it's the influence of this organization on the American government to influence the Israeli government, to influence the human rights situation. But somehow threaded through this is kind of a subtext about American Jews and what they are, what they should be, or what they could be. What's the solution to this problem? And the solution in the eyes of Amnesty is to focus on better communication. So this report goes on to say, we have not done a great job of explaining ourselves to the public. So we need to focus more on explaining what our mission is, explaining how we take pains to be neutral, how we've striven to deal with these issues, how we do deal with anti-Semitism, and explain that there's no conspiracy here, right? That we're a transparent organization. So how are we going to do that? Through more communications and PR work. And so here, finally, we get back to that op-ed I mentioned to you. This is the context in which these staffers in New York in 1988, in April to be precise, sit down to draft this op-ed. And we can see from the drafts, they go through several, and they're really having a hard time of it, but they have a sense this is a moment to say something about Israel and about human rights. And so here's another version of the quote. The dream, this is the title of the draft op-ed. The dream, right? It's double dream. One dream is thousands of years old. 40 years ago, it became a reality. The state of Israel had been an ideal that had provided life to a people persecuted almost since time began. It goes on to talk about that, right? This ideal of what Israel was and Zionism and how it was fulfilled in 1948. And then there's another dream, also thousands of years old, the dream of human rights. The dream of a world where the dignity and right to self-determination of all of the world's citizens is respected. And it goes on and says, for this to work, for this to succeed, Israel has to do better on human rights, right? Here's the quote. The future of Israel depends on it, on human rights. The future of the world may depend on it. So, first of all, I think it's very striking, right, that the leaders in Amnesty imagine that the future of the world depends on Israel, right? I think that shows you something about a certain focus and maybe an inflated focus on Israel, because you might say that Israel, for its own sake or for the Palestinian sake, should improve its human rights record. But I'm not sure that the future of the world depends on it, despite what the rabbis or the politicians may tell us. But they think it's worth making that argument. What's instructive is why this op-ed never runs. Why doesn't it run? Well, the other colleagues reviewing this and responding to it say, no way. First of all, they say, you just can't tie the creation of Israel to human rights. They're not the same at all. Israel was a nation state. The Jews wanted it, fine. Human rights is a different story. I would argue that you could, and that's what I try to make that argument in my book, that they actually share a lot and are connected. But they say you can't do that. Second, one of the people says, this is just going to get us, everyone angry with us about Israel and that we're ganging up on Israel. And then somebody else says, you can't say this because where are the Palestinians? And this is part of the issue. They're kind of left out of this, right? The creation of Israel was not the Palestinian dream, right? So you've now made this op-ed where you've said it's all about this dream of Israel, Jews, and human rights. But in fact, you don't have any focus on the other party to this conflict and the party that ostensibly we as a human rights organization are very concerned about. So our whole imagination of this is kind of off, and our rhetoric is off, and it's just tone deaf. And finally, the critique I like the most is one in which someone simply says, it's just too starry-eyed, the ending. The world depended on it. That's not what we're supposed to do. The business of human rights is to inspire idealism, but then to focus on concrete issues. Let's not go with this preachy rhetoric about world peace and so on and so forth. They killed the op-ed. Spoiler. And that was the end of that. But we're still in that moment. So I want to close by talking for a few minutes about what I think all this winding path through these decades and these leaders and these controversies really says about the moment we're in, and about this idea of American Jews, human rights, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Today, Amnesty, in a lot of senses, is a prisoner of Zion. And what I've tried to show today in this lecture is that, in a lot of ways, its own imagination was always focused in a certain way on Israel. Not necessarily always in a way with a demonization of Israel, but always with a kind of intuition that this is an important place, an idea on which to try out new ideas about what human rights can be. So the first proof of that is what I described to you after 1967, when the leadership says, well, we've never done an investigation of a war zone, and we've never dealt with prisoners with the violence issue, but we want to try it, and we're going to try it here. They didn't have to choose Israel. They could have chosen other conflict zones. But they had an intuition that we needed to do this. And in the book, I talk about what's driving that more in terms of British human rights activism and some other things. Because they're using Israel to think through a problem and imagine what human rights could be for them. Then we see very quickly that this issue of symmetry pops up, right? And then it's an idea of, well, if we have a very thorny conflict, if we have to find a balance, then we can show with the choice of the right frames that we can get the balance. But then again, this becomes a problem because it points back to the question of how you choose the frame, what the balance is. And for the American Jewish leaders, it makes a challenge for them because they want to say, well, the right balance is to address this issue where Jews may be on the side of power and may be inflicting human rights abuses, may or may not be, and this where Jews are victims. But that suddenly becomes the argument that we hear today, right? Which is, well, what's the right thing to compare? Is it whataboutism to raise this issue? Is it your self-interest as a Jew who's doing this, or is this just a neutral interest in trying to get it right? So these issues are worked out for the first time in the 70s through Amnesty and its American Jewish leaders. And they're not resolved, but they're using this as a case to work through it. And finally, I'm arguing that in the 1980s, again, this question of influence. This happens to be the point in time also where there's a rising discourse in this country about Israel advocacy, about lobbying, about the idea of Jews having power and influence. And Amnesty itself is also struggling with that, as well as struggling with the whole issue of what it means to have influence, when influence is seen as something malign, right? That human rights shouldn't be about influence, except for making people change their minds. It shouldn't be about sort of political interests, right? And these are things that are very hard to disentangle, and I think that's why they're worked out on this site of Israel and Jews again and again. So my suggestion here is that in that sense, Amnesty becomes kind of a captive to this dynamic of focusing on Israel. American Jews are also captives to it, however. And you can see already from the 70s, they're stuck with exactly how to think about this, where they're also judging each other and judging themselves as they try and figure out what to do, because they can't simply be neutral activists. They feel they have to take a stand one way or another, and they're anticipating that if they don't, something bad will happen, and if they do, something bad will happen. So there's this deep self-consciousness that begins to kick into this. I think I'd be remiss if I ended this lecture without saying the Palestinians are also prisoners of Zion, because they're both everywhere and nowhere in this story. And it's very striking how little they're talked about in some of these discussions among these leaders. Even as they argue about an individual case, the larger issue of Palestinians and human rights is something which is curiously absent in strange ways. And so they're almost captive to this. And I think you can see ways in which that pattern continues to the present, where people argue about American Jews, Israel-Palestine human rights, and they often argue about what American Jews are doing or not doing, but they often don't actually focus on the Palestinian experience and Palestinian agency in the story. And finally, I think it's fair to say that the U.S. becomes a prisoner of Zion, in the sense that the way American foreign policy is made is always now refracted through these debates about Israel, right, and about the imagination of what America should do in the world. The simple truth is that American Jews succeed in freeing the Jews of the Soviet Union, not through Amnesty and not through the international human rights movement, but through convincing America that this is an American foreign policy issue that will help with the Cold War. And the price of that success was to kind of tie these things together. So then we're debating again and again and again what it means to do politics and what are kosher politics and which are not. And these symbols are, again, sort of the ways in which everyone is using this to this day, right? Amnesty International, defending human rights, Anti-Semitism International, right? That it's the very antithesis of what it's supposed to do. Amnesty International as an organization which actually needs to investigate America more, right? Not just the world. And of course, Amnesty International is focused on this contentious issue about BDS and about what should be done vis-a-vis the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So what I'm describing to you isn't a solution or any less always, but it's a story about how all of these different actors come to be prisoners of Zion, and much of it has to do with the way they imagine themselves and imagine what human rights can be and what it will be in the future. Thank you very much. So I'm happy to field some questions and tell me what you think. Actually, I'll do what the moderator would say. Ask me a question, not a comment. Thank you. Yes?
You're aware that the ACLU is going through a similar topic within itself? 60 Minutes last Sunday.
No.
Irving Lasser was interviewed about his break with ACLU. And the ACLU is going around the country filing lawsuits in states that have anti-DBS legislation being overturned in the First Amendment.
Yes.
You know anything about their argument?
I went to law school, but I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to make a legal opinion. I don't have I'm not going to venture opinion. I will say, yeah, I think this is a broader story. So what I wanted to share with you tonight were some reflections about these stories as they go through this organization. You can tell a similar story about other civil rights or human rights groups. Human Rights Watch is another organization which famously had, as it was called, a civil war play out not too many years ago over similar issues. So yes, I think that's true. I do think that one thing we can say, and it's a sensitive issue to say this, but one thing I've tried to show is this isn't only about these organizations and their politics, it's also about dramas of Jewish identity, which Jewish identity is diverse internally, and as I tried to convey here, there's lots of different opinions. And sometimes these are sort of intra-Jewish fights that play out in these organizations that can drive a lot of this. So yeah, I think you're seeing similar. We are bound to see more about that. Yeah. 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 Yes. So thank you for the question. I think that's a lovely way of putting it, a laboratory, right, for experimenting. I think there's some truth to that. You know, in the book I talk about how when the Amnesty leadership went to Israel in 1968, 1969, they basically said, come on, we have a great idea here. Let's do the first ever joint investigation between a human rights group and a government, where you and we will together do this. That way, you will satisfy yourselves that we're doing right by you, and we will get access to things that we want access to. And they used that language. This is an experiment. This could be a new model, right? So that is exactly the language of experimental, research. And as I described here and alluded to, it fell apart. It didn't work. So I do think that's the case. And why they do that. One reason why they do that is the reason that's often given, which is that Israel is just a very open society, right? So it's easy to do much of this work there. With an open media, right? It's a very easy place for Western journalists to work, so it's an easy place to do that. It has changed, and it's a whole other discussion about human rights and organizations in Israeli society today. But it's accessible, and that's one thing. I think there's another dynamic, which is that there is a way in which human rights activism, as I alluded to, as it tries to imagine a borderless world and tries to imagine a universal cosmopolitan humanity, the Jews become an interesting case study. And when I say the Jews, I mean that deliberately as like a locus, a people and a symbol that just as through many phases of history, different groups have focused on the Jews as a symbol of capitalism, right? As a symbol of Marxism, right? A symbol of different things, a symbol of modernity. So Zionism and Israel as a symbol of nationalism is in a certain sense kind of irresistible to a kind of human rights imagination. I don't think that means it presupposes any one outcome, but I think there is something about that, and I think of this certain kind of Christianist universalism that does underlie it, where Israel becomes the site on which to imagine, to experiment, and to project certain ideals. And that doesn't take away from what Israel's doing, to make itself Exhibit A, because there's a military occupation which continues to this day, right? But I do think it helps to explain the choices that organizations make, right? I'm not someone who sees this all as a conspiracy or all as anti-Semitic, nor do I see this as all inevitable. I think what we see when we look through this with a historian's gaze is choices, right? And debates about those choices. As you can see in this organization, debating, are we right to focus on this? And if so, what about this, right? And so, yes, there's a laboratory effect that really does capture a lot of what happens. Yeah.
How does it factor into the imagination? Because
Yeah.
you said earlier it's about how you imagine human life.
Yeah.
But the story you described is not how you imagine human life, but how people imagine themselves you.
Yes. Yeah.
And because that's what's behind all the choices.
Yes. Yeah.
So, anyway, that seems to determine aspects
Yeah.
of that, right?
Right. So yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. It is an imagination of the Jews and the election, an inflation of the Jews into a symbol of, the paradigm for what's wrong with human rights violations, or the paradigm for what should be virtuous about a country, or the paradigm for influence, right? I mean, this is one of the biggest problems, that some of these people I've described find themselves suddenly cast in a play they didn't realize they were in, right? Where suddenly, I'm doing this, I may be inspired by my Jewish heritage, but I'm not doing this wearing a Jewish hat, right? I'm doing this. But suddenly they're being imagined as representing a Jewish concern, right? And I think that is a big challenge that explains, again, some of the dynamics that fuel this. That's even more striking in the British case, where you have people specifically saying, well, Amnesty's always been run by Jews, right? Or pointing to Peter Benenson, who I alluded to, and saying, well, everything can be explained by the fact that here's a Jew who converted to Catholicism, and that tells you all you need to know about self-hatred, right? So I think that these dynamics are very much there. And I want to emphasize, that's not to discredit human rights, right? It's really just to see how Jews become a site for imagining universalism, right? And precisely because Jews are often so identified as cosmopolitans, then the question is always, well, do we detect invisible roots that pull them back towards some parochial concern? And that seems to be what drives much of this focus on who are these people who run this, right? Right. Well, I think it is that because, and this, I'm not making a radically new argument. I think many people who've tried to historicize the international human rights movement have said, what was it, right? Well, it is a kind of search for a cosmopolitan, moral, global humanity, right? Kantian or otherwise. And so therefore, you have this problem that's in the Enlightenment where, well, the Jews are a kind of a fossil. They don't quite fit in unless they're truly emancipated from all their Jewishness. And you can see a kind of attempt to do something similar here, right? And that is very much that is very much the dynamic that operates. And the fascinating challenge is for these Jewish leaders who say, I don't want to be anyone's symbol. I just want to do what I think is right here and do this or that. It's not so easy, they find. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Amen. Yeah. We'll see. We'll see. We'll see. I will say this. There is another chapter to this, and it's another chapter that I'm not going to lecture to you about tonight, but it is an interesting chapter because there are new organizations in Israel who are right-wing organizations who say, we're all for human rights. We want to support human rights. We want to take it back from the left. And human rights for us can mean treating Palestinians with dignity, but don't talk to us about changing the political arrangements. So that's another twist on it, and that could easily evolve regardless of what this election brings or doesn't bring. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I was struck by that too, because if you look at my book, it's really about a story about men. And I've written recently about that and reflecting on it. And that's because that first generation of human rights activists were overwhelmingly international lawyers, or what I call para-lawyers. And so they reflected the kind of, I think, gravitation towards that profession, especially for Jewish men who were emasculated in European society. This is kind of a heroic but safe way to do something. And there are many women involved in what I call internationalism in the same period who are not choosing this legal human rights sphere to do it, especially in Europe. But then you look over here and you look at the 60s and 70s and you see a different dynamic. Most of those people I showed you were not lawyers. And they are people who, they're hard to describe pithily in a lecture because they wear many different hats, starting groups, starting organizations, what we would recognize as historians as kind of informal leadership, informal activism, and entrepreneurship, right? So I think that is part of it. There's not a lot of direct commentary in the period I'm describing to you about gender. There's not a lot of self-conscious reflection. I think that is because the human rights movement, including Amnesty, was not interested, right? And this was a fight that took place later on, really. The 70s was also the era of trying to introduce international women as an issue. And then even for another decade it took, in fact, there was serious conflicts within Amnesty about gender discrimination and about these issues. So that is striking given what you're describing, like who is joining this fight and who's leading this. And I don't know what else that can tell us about this, except it does reflect those dynamics of women sort of heavily present, rising into the American Jewish and American leadership sphere in civil society, and yet also still very much on the margins, and their gender identities as not being brought directly to the fore of the work they're doing. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Jeff.
Maybe I'll ask the story that you're telling us is a very familiar story, but particularly for the organization from the Jewish organization. There's a lot of Jews in the right from ACLU. But the United Nations, of course, followed a similar trajectory.
Yeah.
I wonder if you can comment on if you see that as the same phenomenon, part of the same phenomenon, or if it's slightly different dynamic going on with the United Nations.
Yeah.
Actually make that the last question.
Okay, yeah, we should, yes, thank you. Yeah, the United Nations is a very interesting organization. When I was working on this, I found this great letter from an Israeli diplomat complaining that it seems that everyone applying for jobs at the UN, this is in 1950, all of them seem to have German last names, and they're all Jews applying for these jobs. And so there are many Jews, emigres, refugees, and others who are attracted to the UN. And the UN very quickly actually has to deal with this same problem. Already in the 1950s, there are issues about anti-Semitism and discrimination in the bureaucracy. And already Arab countries are coming and saying, you can't have Jews work on this issue. And then the UN is saying, what do we do with that kind of allegation? We can't be discriminated against people. On the other hand, who are these people and how do we classify them? And yeah, so there's a parallel dynamic there. And I'll just say, what I think it points to is something that maybe this will be a nice way to tie together what we're all talking about here. What that shows is not just that there's a long pattern. It shows the impossibility of building a truly cosmopolitan citizenship that is separate from the lands and countries and social environments we inhabit, right? And so just like Amnesty tries to create a truly universal organization where we all work together and we set apart our identities, it doesn't. People still end up being American and American Jewish, and of being British and British Jewish, and struggling with that. And this is what happens for the people, I think, who work at the UN as well. So that doesn't mean it's not a worthwhile endeavor, but it means it always comes back to the local and the place in which it takes place. And I think that dynamic follows Jews, and I think it's also why Jews become, because of the precise fact that Jews don't fit in from the Enlightenment onwards, they don't fit in neatly, right? That they become a great place for every other people and community to reflect on this very precise problem of what is humanity, right? And how do you define it? So I don't have the answer to that, but I think we see that it's presented here. And thank you for coming to listen to it.